Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are stepping inside what is arguably the most high-stakes, photorealistic, automated manufacturing plant on Earth, the living cell. I want you to imagine your DNA not just as some static blueprint sitting in a library, but as a highly physical, dynamic template. Picture it moving through a microscopic factory line at absolute lightning speed. It's truly mind-blowing when you think about it.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a clear roadmap for today. We'll kick things off by decoding DNA metabolism, take a tour of the replication factory, look at how new strands are synthesized, dig into quality control and mutations, and finally, wrap up with DNA repair mechanisms.
But before we get into the nuts and bolts, we really need to understand the staggering evolutionary stakes here. As our source material points out, the capacity of living cells to preserve their genetic material results entirely from the structural complementarity between the two strands of the DNA molecule. Basically, if this biological factory makes a typo and fails to fix it, that error gets passed right on to the next generation. So yeah, it's literally a matter of survival.
All right, Section 1, Decoding DNA Metabolism, the basic rules. So there are a few basic principles that apply to DNA synthesis across the board in every single organism, and the absolutely crucial one to anchor our understanding is semi-conservative replication. See, when we go from one DNA molecule to two, we don't just, build a brand new double helix from scratch. Instead, the two original parent strands unzip, and each one serves as a template. The end result? Two new DNA molecules, but each one contains one original parent strand and one newly synthesized daughter strand. It's like the old saying goes, a little bit of old, a little bit of new.
Now, as we start decoding all this machinery, you're going to notice some distinct naming conventions depending on the organism we're talking about. In the streamlined bacterial world, gene naming is highly organized, typically 3 italicized lowercase letters, like DNA A. Super simple, right? But when we scale up to massive eukaryotic systems, like yeast or us humans, it's kind of the Wild West. There's no single convention, it's wildly varied. You get names like RAD51. For today's explainer, we're primarily going to stick to the beautifully organized bacterial system to really nail down those fundamental mechanics before we even think about scaling up. Moving on to Section 2, the replication factory. Let's look at the replisome machinery. And this brilliantly illustrates what we call the replisome. Think of this as a massive assembly line made up of over 20 specific enzymes and proteins working in absolutely perfect coordination. They're your factory crew. You've got helicase, which acts as the motor to physically unwind the tightly coiled DNA. Primase drops down these short RNA primers to basically tell the factory, hey, start here. Then DNA polymerase 3 is the heavy machinery doing the actual synthesizing. Ligase swoops in like glue to seal any gaps, and single-stranded binding proteins act as temporary scaffolding to keep those unwound strands from just snapping back together. And the craziest part? This entire crew is coordinated by ATP hydrolysis, acting as a mechanical timer to switch these tiny machines on and off in exact milliseconds. No way, right? This whole manufacturing process goes down in 3 highly coordinated mechanical phases. Step 1 is initiation. This kicks off at a very specific spot called the origin, where the DNA is initially unwound. Then we hit Step 2, elongation. This is where the factory machinery just chugs along, continuously adding new nucleotides. And finally, Step 3 is termination. The replication forks, which, by the way, have been moving bidirectionally away from the origin, finally converge, and the whole machinery just cleanly detaches. Section 3, synthesizing new strands. Let's dig deeper into the elongation phase. Okay, the absolute star of the show here is DNA polymerase. Structurally speaking, it operates quite literally like a physical hand. It's actually got regions biochemically referred to as the palm, the fingers, and the thumb. It cups right over the DNA template. The insertion site, the active site where the magical chemical reaction actually happens, is tucked right inside that grip. But to keep this hand from constantly slipping off the DNA track, it uses this ingenious thing called a beta sliding clamp. This clamp literally locks around the DNA, allowing the polymerase to slide across thousands of base pairs with incredible precisivity without ever letting go. It's a real game changer for the cell. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is the fascinating geometric problem the factory runs into. See, new DNA can only be synthesized in one specific direction, 5' to 3', period. But because the 2 strands of DNA run anti-parallel in opposite directions, the factory has to employ 2 totally different strategies. On one side, you have the leading strand.
Synthesis here is continuous and happy, just chasing right behind the unwinding fork. Easy. But the other side? That's the lagging strand. To keep building 5' to 3' while the overall fork is moving the other way, the DNA has to perform these crazy complex looping gymnastics. It ends up being built discontinuously in these short chunks called Okazaki fragments, which are later sewn together by DNA ligase. It is such an elegant solution to a massive biological hurdle. Section 4. Quality control and mutations. Time for some error checking.
So without proofreading, the natural chemistry of these bases would result in a biological typo about once every 10,000 to 100,000 base pairs. Now, I know that sounds pretty good at first, until you realize your genome is literally billions of letters long. An error rate like that would be absolutely lethal. Thankfully, DNA polymerase comes with a built-in quality control department, a 3' to 5' exonuclease activity. It literally checks its own work. If it feels the geometry of a new base pair is off, it hits the brakes, moves the sequence backward into an editing site, chops out the error, and tries again. This proofreading drops the error rate to a staggering 1 in 1 billion. I mean, talk about precision.
To tie all this dense biochemistry directly back to human stakes, let's look at the Ames test, which was developed back in the 1970s. This test basically asks, how easily can a chemical break past our DNA's defenses and cause mutations? Here's how it works. You take a strain of salmonella that can't produce its own histidine, meaning it absolutely shouldn't grow on a plate without it. Then, you add a chemical compound of interest. If bacterial colonies suddenly sprout up, it means the compound caused a mutation that accidentally restored the bacteria's ability to grow. It's a brilliantly simple test, and it identifies mutagens and potential carcinogens by exploiting the exact same repair or mutation machinery we've been talking about. Which brings us to Section 5, DNA repair mechanisms, fixing the blueprint.
Because, as we established, survival is strictly on the line here, the cell spares absolutely no energy expense to repair its DNA. Most of these repair processes follow a universal, highly specialized cleanup sequence. Step 1 is identification. Scanning enzymes patrol the DNA looking for distortions or lesions. Step 2 is cutting. An endonuclease comes in and removes the damaged section, kind of like a surgeon excising bad tissue. Step 3 is replacement. A DNA polymerase swoops in to fill the newly created gap with pristine nucleotides. And finally, step 4 is sealing. Our trusty DNA ligase stitches the sugar phosphate backbone completely shut, good as new.
So the crucial point here is how the factory actually knows what to fix. Let's break down 3 major repair types. Base excision uses specific glycosylases to pluck out single bad bases, like if a cytosine spontaneously deaminates. Then you have nucleotide excision, which handles big, bulky structural distortions by literally chopping out larger chunks, usually 13 to 29 nucleotides. But I really want to look closer at mismatch repair, which fixes replication errors right after they happen. The big question is, how does the machine know which strand is the old correct one and which is the new typo? Well, it cleverly uses hemimethylation. For a brief little window, the old parent strand still has methyl tags on it, while the newly synthesized strand does not. The repair crew reads these tags, knows to leave the old master blueprint alone, and only makes its cuts on the new unmethylated strand. Nature is just incredibly smart.
Let's look at a real-world medical application to see how all this builds together. Because viral DNA polymerases operate slightly differently from our own eukaryotic ones, we can actually exploit those differences. Take the antiviral drug acyclovir, which is commonly used for herpes simplex. It looks exactly like a standard guanine nucleotide, but it completely lacks the closed pentose ring. When the viral polymerase grabs it and tries to insert it into the growing DNA chain, it acts as a total molecular dead end. Because it's missing the necessary attachment points, synthesis completely stalls out. It shuts down the viral replication factory entirely, without harming our own eukaryotic machinery in the process.
The whole system is just an absolute marvel of molecular engineering. But, it leaves us with a pretty profound thought to end on. With such an incredibly precise, energy-intensive factory working relentlessly day in and day out to keep us alive, what happens to our biology when these ultimate repair mechanisms are hijacked by toxins or when they finally begin to break down with age? That delicate, fragile balance between faithful replication and fatal mutation is the very edge upon which all life rests. Thanks for tuning in to this explainer and keep questioning the incredible machinery inside you.